The Wright Brothers by David McCullough. Picture a young man with everything going for him: brilliant mind, athletic build, a future so bright people whispered about Yale. He seemed destined for greatness. Then, one winter afternoon, during a casual hockey game on a frozen lake, everything changed in a heartbeat. A hockey stick, swung with violent force, crashed into his face and shattered most of his front teeth. The physical agony was unbearable, but what happened next was even worse. This vibrant, promising young man simply disappeared from the world. He locked himself away for 3 entire years, watching his dreams crumble to dust. Yale became a closed door. His days melted into a routine of nursing his dying mother and losing himself in books, page after page after page. To everyone watching, it looked like a tragedy, a brilliant life completely derailed. But something else was happening in that dark, isolated room. With every book he devoured, seeds were being planted for an idea so wild, so seemingly impossible, that it would eventually shock the world. That broken young man was Wilbur Wright, and that devastating accident, it might have been the single most crucial event that set him on course to change history forever. Today, we're diving into the remarkable story of the Wright Brothers, a beautifully crafted tale by master historian David McCullough. This isn't just about inventing the airplane. It runs much deeper than that. This is about family bonds, insatiable curiosity, and the quiet power of relentless dedication in a world that worships spectacle and noise. It's about 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, with no fancy degrees, no government grants, and no powerful friends, who cracked a puzzle that had defeated the greatest minds for centuries. By the time we're done, you'll discover the secret ingredient that let Wilbur and Orville succeed, where wealthy, famous, and far more connected men crashed and burned. It has nothing to do with genius and everything to do with character. And trust me, it's a lesson that can completely transform how you approach your own challenges, dreams, and the path stretching out before you. So let's dive in. To really understand Wilbur and Orville, you need to understand the home they grew up in. It wasn't filled with money, but with something far more precious: books and ideas everywhere. Their father, Bishop Milton Wright, was a traveling preacher with rock-solid convictions and an even stronger faith in the power of reading. He packed their home at 7 Hawthorne Street with books on every subject imaginable: history, science, poetry, philosophy. He even encouraged his children to read famous agnostics, not to shake their faith, but to teach them to think independently. His philosophy was simple: encourage intellectual curiosity. He didn't panic if the kids skipped school to chase a project they cared about. He believed the education they got at home, through reading and tinkering and passionate debates, mattered just as much as any classroom. As Orville later reflected, the greatest gift they ever received was growing up in a family where curiosity was celebrated. Their mother, Susan Kerner Wright, was the quiet force at the heart of everything. Painfully shy, but with remarkable mechanical talent. While the bishop brought home books, Susan showed the children how to build things with her own hands. She could craft toys that rivaled anything from a store. The brothers were convinced their mechanical genius and Orville's shyness came straight from her. Their story, the one they told for the rest of their lives, started with a toy. One evening, the bishop came home with a small, helicopter-like contraption from France, made of cork, bamboo, and paper, powered by a twisted rubber band. He tossed it up, and it flew to the ceiling. The boys were mesmerized. They called it the mocking bat. They played with it until it fell apart, then built their own versions, each one slightly bigger, slightly better. That simple toy, a gift from their father, planted something deep inside them. It was their first taste of the magic of a man-made object, defying gravity. As they grew up, they became, as their father put it, inseparable as twins. They lived in the same house their entire lives, worked together every single day, shared a joint bank account, and seemed to think as one unit. Yet they couldn't have been more different. Wilbur, 4 years older, was the deep thinker, the visionary. After his brutal hockey accident, he'd turned inward, becoming a reading machine. He had an incredible memory and laser focus. He was the big-picture guy, the one who wrote their letters and explained their theories with stunning clarity. More serious, more driven, someone who lived, as a friend once said, largely in a world of his own. Orville was the hands-on mechanical wizard, more cheerful and optimistic, the natural entrepreneur. While still in high school, he launched his own print shop in a shed out back, building his printing press from a discarded tombstone and scrap metal. More sensitive than Wilbur, more easily stung by criticism, but with a spark of creative ingenuity that could solve almost any mechanical challenge thrown his way. Together they were unstoppable. Wilbur would dream up the grand theory, and Orville would figure out how to build the machine to test it. They argued constantly, voices rising to shouting matches, but that was their process for hammering out ideas. Often they'd start arguing opposite positions, and, after an hour of heated debate, find they'd completely convinced each other and switched sides. Their first real business together wasn't aviation, but printing. They published a local newspaper called the West Side News. Wilbur edited, Orville published. But then a new craze swept the nation and changed their trajectory: the bicycle. Bicycles in the 1890s weren't just transportation. They were symbols of freedom and modernity. The brothers fell hard for them and soon opened the Wright Cycle Company. This shop became their laboratory. Working with tools, metal, and wood, they sharpened the skills that would make everything else possible. They didn't just sell and fix bikes. They started building their own models, the Van Cleve and the St. Clair, which brought in solid income. But even as their business flourished, Wilbur felt restless, sensing he was meant for something bigger. The dream of flight, planted by that little toy helicopter years before, had never really disappeared. Then, in the summer of 1896, two events converged to seal their destiny. First, Orville contracted typhoid fever and spent weeks hovering near death. As he slowly recovered, Wilbur sat by his bedside reading aloud. The news was full of stories about a German aviator named Otto Lilienthal, known as the Flying Man. Lilienthal was a hero to anyone dreaming of flight. He'd built a series of gliders and made over 2,000 successful flights, launching himself from a hill and gliding through the air, steering by shifting his body weight. He was the first to really prove that flight was possible. His philosophy was to learn from birds, to understand the secrets of their curved wings. But that August, the news Wilbur read to Orville turned tragic. Otto Lilienthal had crashed. A sudden gust of wind stalled his glider, and he plummeted 50 feet to the ground, breaking his spine. He died the next day. Lilienthal's death, Wilbur later said, sparked an interest that had been sleeping since childhood. It was a wake-up call. The problem of flight wasn't just a dream. It was a life-or-death challenge. And Lilienthal's fatal flaw, the brothers concluded, wasn't getting into the air but his inability to control the machine once airborne. Shifting body weight simply wasn't enough. This became their central mission, solving the problem of control. Riding bicycles had taught them about the critical importance of balance. A bike doesn't stay upright by itself. the writer makes constant tiny adjustments. They figured a flying machine would be the same, just in 3 dimensions. It needed a control system. Wilbur started spending hours watching birds, not just admiring them but studying their mechanics. He noticed how buzzards and hawks twisted their wingtips to maintain balance in gusty winds. One evening, while fidgeting with an empty inner tube box in the bicycle shop, he had his breakthrough. He twisted the box, watching how opposite corners moved up and down. In that simple motion he saw the answer. If the wings of a biplane could be twisted, or warped, the same way, the pilot could adjust the angle each wing met the air. This would let the pilot control the aircraft's roll, to bank, and turn with precision, just like a bird. This concept, wing warping, was a massive and completely original breakthrough. On May 30th, 1899, Wilbur sat down and wrote a letter that would change everything. He addressed it to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. In it, he declared his belief that human flight was possible and practical. He asked for any papers they'd published on the subject. He was careful to add one crucial line: "I am an enthusiast, but not a crank." The Smithsonian sent back a reading list, and the brothers dove into the work of leading thinkers in aviation, people like Octave Chanute, a celebrated engineer, and Samuel Pierpont Langley, the head of the Smithsonian itself. They were entering a field packed with dreamers, eccentrics, and tragic failures. Langley, backed by $50,000 from the U.S. War Department, an absolute fortune at the time, was building a massive, gasoline-powered flying machine called the aerodrome. It was the high-tech, big-budget project of the era. The Wrights, by contrast, were working with a few $100s earned from their bicycle shop. In the summer of 1899, they built their first aircraft, a 5-foot biplane kite. They flew it in a field outside Dayton, controlling the wing warping with 4 lines running down to sticks in their hands. The test worked. The kite responded to their commands. The theory held up. Next step: build a full-sized glider that could carry a person. But where to test it? They needed a place with strong, steady winds, soft sand for landings, and just as importantly, privacy. They wrote to the U.S. Weather Bureau, which sent wind velocity records from across the country. One remote, desolate spot jumped out, a sliver of sand on the Outer Banks of North Carolina called Kitty Hawk. In September 1900, Wilbur set off alone. His journey to Kitty Hawk was an adventure in itself, involving a leaky boat and a terrifying storm on the Albemarle Sound. When he finally arrived, he found a place of stark, windswept beauty and complete isolation. The locals were fishermen, descendants of shipwrecked sailors, hardy and welcoming people who couldn't help thinking the brothers were, as one later said, just a pair of poor nuts. When Orville arrived, they assembled their first glider. It had a 17-foot wingspan and a forward elevator to control pitch. Wilbur would lie flat on the lower wing. They started by flying it as a kite, getting a feel for its power. The pull was ferocious. Then Wilbur began making manned glides. He'd run down the slope of a sand dune, and for a few brief, thrilling seconds, he was airborne. They only achieved a few minutes of total flight time that first year, but they learned something crucial and disappointing. The machine produced far less lift than the accepted scientific tables predicted. The experts, they realized, were wrong. They returned to Dayton and faced a choice: trust the established data or trust their own experience. They chose their experience. And this led to one of the most brilliant chapters in their story. Back in the upstairs room of the bicycle shop, they built a small 6-foot-long wooden box, a wind tunnel. Inside, they mounted a fan, powered by their noisy little gasoline engine. Then they created a series of miniature metal wing shapes, or airfoils, and meticulously tested each one, measuring lift and drag with ingenious balances they fashioned from bicycle spokes and hacksaw blades. For months they worked late into freezing nights, testing over 200 different wing shapes. It was slow, tedious, and utterly groundbreaking work. In the end, they'd created their own completely new and completely accurate set of aeronautical tables. They now knew, with scientific certainty, the most efficient wing shape for their aircraft. As one historian later wrote, "Never in the history of the world had men studied the problem with such scientific skill, nor with such undaunted courage." They returned to Kitty Hawk in 1902 with a new glider, built on their own data. It was a massive improvement. They made nearly 1,000 glides, soaring for hundreds of feet at a time. Orville was now flying too, and they were truly mastering the art of control. But they discovered a new problem. Sometimes, when trying to correct a roll with the wing warping, the machine would slide sideways and spin. Lying awake one night, unable to sleep, Orville had an idea. What if the rear vertical rudder, which had been fixed, was made movable? And what if its movement was coordinated with the wing warping system? The next morning he proposed it to Wilbur. They built it, tested it, and it worked perfectly. They'd solved the last major piece of the control puzzle. They'd invented the 3-axis control system, pitch, roll, and yaw, that's still used in every aircraft today. They now knew they could fly. All that was left was to give their machine power. They returned to Dayton and began work on what they called the Flyer. They wrote to a dozen automobile engine manufacturers, asking if they could provide an engine light enough and powerful enough. They got only one response: for an engine that was way too heavy. So they did what they always did, decided to build it themselves. Or rather, they turned to the man who ran their shop while they were away, a brilliant mechanic named Charlie Taylor. With nothing more than a few rough sketches, Charlie built a 4-cylinder 12-horsepower gasoline engine with a cast aluminum block, a marvel of lightweight engineering for its time. Next came the propellers. They assumed they could use formulas for marine propellers, but quickly discovered no reliable science existed. An air propeller, they realized, was essentially a wing rotating in a spiral course. For months they argued and debated, filling pages with calculations. "Our minds," Orville said, "became so obsessed with it that we could do little other work." In the end, they designed and hand-carved 2 beautiful 8.5-foot propellers that were astonishingly efficient, a masterpiece of engineering just as critical to their success as the engine or the wings. While they were perfecting their machine, Samuel Langley was preparing for his second attempt. On December 8, 1903, with the press and crowds watching, Langley's great aerodrome, with his pilot Charles Manley at the controls, was launched from its houseboat on the Potomac River. It plunged, like a handful of mortar, straight into the icy water. The project was a humiliating, multi-thousand-dollar failure. The papers mocked Langley mercilessly. The dream of flight, it seemed, was dead. 9 days later, on the windswept sands of Kitty Hawk, it was a bitterly cold Thursday morning. December 17, 1903. A 25-mile-per-hour wind was blowing from the north. The brothers hung a sheet on the side of their shed, a signal to the men at the nearby life-saving station. Only 5 men showed up. They'd seen the gliders fly and had faith, but most locals thought it was too cold to watch. Another flying machine not fly. Wilbur and Orville flipped a coin. Wilbur had won the toss on their first attempt a few days earlier, which had ended in a minor crash, so now it was Orville's turn. He lay down on the lower wing, his hips in the cradle that controlled the wing warping and rudder, Wilbur steadied the wingtip. The little engine sputtered to life. At 10:35 in the morning, the machine started down its short wooden launching rail, Orville at the controls, Wilbur running alongside. It lifted into the air. The flight was, in Orville's words, extremely erratic. The flyer rose, dipped, bounced, and dipped again. It lasted only 12 seconds. It covered only 120 feet, less than half a football field. But it was a true flight. For the first time in history, a heavier-than-air machine had taken off under its own power, flown forward under control, and landed at a point as high as where it started. They flew 3 more times that day, taking turns. The final flight, with Wilbur at the controls, was the most impressive. He flew 852 feet and stayed in the air for 59 seconds. As they stood discussing their triumph, a sudden gust of wind caught the flyer and sent it tumbling across the sand, smashing it to pieces. Its flying days were over. But it had done its job. That afternoon they walked to the weather station and sent a telegram to their father in Dayton. Success 4 flights Thursday morning, average speed through air 31 miles, longest 59 seconds, inform press, home Christmas. The local paper in Dayton ran a small, inaccurate story on an inside page. The editor of the Associated Press had been offered the story but turned it down, saying that if it had been 57 minutes, it might have been news. The world, for the most part, didn't know or didn't believe what had happened. But Wilbur and Orville knew. They'd solved the problem. The next 2 years were a period of intense, quiet work. They didn't return to Kitty Hawk. Instead, they found a cow pasture 8 miles from Dayton called Huffman Prairie. The winds were light and shifty, nothing like the steady gales of the Outer Banks. This forced them to invent a catapult, a derrick with a falling weight, to help them get airborne. Here, at Huffman Prairie, they truly learned to fly. They went from staying in the air for a minute to flying for half an hour. They learned to make circles, to do figure eights, to fly with such confidence and control that they'd completely mastered their machine. By the end of 1905, they'd built the world's first practical airplane. They'd made over 100 flights, one lasting 39 minutes and covering 24 miles. And still, the world paid almost no attention. A few local farmers and passengers on the nearby trolley line would occasionally catch a glimpse, but most people thought they were just a couple of eccentric fools wasting their time. The first person to truly recognize the magnitude of what they'd achieved was a man named Amos Root, a beekeeping enthusiast from Medina, Ohio, who published a journal called Gleanings in Bee Culture. He drove down to Huffman Prairie in September 1904 and witnessed Wilbur fly a complete circle. He was thunderstruck. He wrote a detailed, accurate, and passionate eyewitness account, declaring that the world was on the verge of a new era. But since it was published in a beekeeping journal, almost no one of importance read it. Frustrated by the lack of interest in America, they offered their invention to the U.S. War Department. They got a form rejection letter. So they turned their attention to Europe, where there was far more enthusiasm for aviation. In 1908, the decision was made. They would finally show the world what they'd done. Orville would go to Washington to perform the official trials for the U.S. Army at Fort Myer, Virginia. And Wilbur would go to France. Wilbur's arrival in Le Mans, a town south of Paris, was met with deep skepticism. The French press had taken to calling them bluffers. French aviators like Henri Farman and Louis Blériot were making short, straight-line hops in public, and many believed the Wrights' claims of flying for over half an hour were lies. Wilbur worked for weeks, patiently assembling his flyer in a room at an automobile factory owned by a man named Léon Boulay. On August 8, 1908, Before a small but influential crowd at the Hunadieres racetrack, he was finally ready. He wore his ordinary gray suit and a cap. There was no fanfare. He started the engine, took off, and climbed into the air. Then he did something no one in Europe had ever seen. He banked gracefully and made a perfect turn, then another. He flew a complete circle, then a figure eight, landing gently right back where he started. The crowd went wild. The stunned silence erupted into a roar. People were shouting, crying, embracing. Louis Blériot, one of France's leading aviators, was there. "I consider that for us in France, and everywhere," he said, "a new era in mechanical flight has commenced." Another pilot, René Gasnier, simply said, "We are children compared to the Wrights." Overnight, Wilbur Wright became the most famous man in Europe. He was no longer a bluffer. He was a hero. Kings, queens, prime ministers, and millionaires flocked to Le Mans to see him fly. He was an enigma to the French. A quiet, modest man who didn't drink, didn't smoke, and showed no interest in the Parisian socialites who adored him. But his skill in the air was undeniable. He had, as one paper declared, conquered the air. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Orville was having his own spectacular success. At Fort Myer, before growing crowds of thousands, he was breaking records almost daily, flying for over an hour at a time. The American public, which had ignored them for so long, was finally captivated. But on September 17, 1908, tragedy struck. Orville was flying with a passenger, a young Army officer named Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge. They were on their fourth lap around the field when a propeller blade split. The machine shuddered, wires snapped, and it plunged to the ground from a height of 75 feet. The crash was horrific. Selfridge was killed, becoming the first person to die in a powered airplane accident. Orville was pulled from the wreckage, barely alive, with a fractured leg, broken ribs, and a dislocated hip. Their sister, Katharine, who had been the unwavering anchor of the family through all their years of struggle, rushed to Washington. For 7 weeks, she nursed Orville back to health, handling the press, managing visitors, and holding everything together. She was, in every sense, the third Wright sibling in this great enterprise. Wilbur, hearing the news in France, was devastated, but he knew he had to continue. 4 days after the crash, he went up and flew for an hour and 31 minutes, setting a new world record in honor of his brother. The following year, 1909, was a whirlwind of triumph. Orville, though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, recovered. He and Katharine joined Wilbur in Europe. The three of them were celebrated across the continent. They met King Edward VII of England and King Alfonso XIII of Spain. Katharine even flew with Wilbur, her skirts tied down with a rope at the ankles, a practical move that accidentally started a fashion craze for the hobble skirt. When they finally returned to America, they were no longer obscure mechanics. They were national heroes. Dayton threw a massive 2-day homecoming celebration. They were honored at the White House by President Taft. That fall, Wilbur made a series of spectacular public flights in New York City, circling the Statue of Liberty and flying up the Hudson River, as 1 million New Yorkers watched in awe from the streets and rooftops below. They'd done it. They'd given the world the gift of flight. But the years that followed weren't easy. They were consumed by business demands and ugly, exhausting patent lawsuits. They'd invented the airplane, and now they had to fight to defend that claim. The strain took its toll. In May of 1912, Wilbur, worn down by stress and overwork, contracted typhoid fever, the same illness Orville had survived years before. But Wilbur wasn't so lucky. On May 30th, at the age of just 45, he died. His father, Bishop Wright, wrote in his diary, "A short life, full of consequences. He was a man of unassuming, quiet ways, and of a courage that was never daunted. In his death, the world has lost one of its greatest men." Orville lived on for another 36 years, becoming a revered elder statesman of aviation, but he was never the same without his brother. The partnership was broken. He sold the Wright Company and spent the rest of his life in quiet retirement, tinkering in his laboratory. He lived to see their invention transform the world in ways they could never have imagined: the birth of commercial air travel, and the terrifying destruction of aerial bombing in 2 world wars. When asked if he had any regrets, Orville compared the airplane to fire. He regretted the terrible damage it had caused, but he believed it was good for the human race that someone had discovered it. On July 20th, 1969, when another man from Ohio, Neil Armstrong, stepped onto the moon, he carried with him a small piece of fabric from the wing of that first 1903 flyer, a tribute from one pioneer to the 2 who had started it all, on a cold, windy day at Kitty Hawk. When you look back on the story of the Wright brothers, it's easy to focus on that one famous photograph from December 17, 1903, the plane lifting off the sand, Wilbur running alongside. We see the moment of invention. But the real lesson, the profound and timeless wisdom in their story, isn't about that one moment. It's about the thousands of unphotographed moments that came before it. It's in the quiet evenings at 7 Hawthorne Street, where a father's love for books taught his children that no problem was too big to understand through study. It's in a mother's hands, showing her sons that they could build anything they could imagine. It's in the years Wilbur spent as a recluse after his accident, reading and thinking, forging the intellectual steel that would be the foundation of their success. And most of all, it's in that little upstairs room at the bicycle shop, in the dead of winter, with a homemade wind tunnel. Think about that for a moment. When all the published data, all the work of the so-called experts, turned out to be wrong, they didn't get discouraged. They didn't give up. They decided, with breathtaking confidence, to create the correct data themselves. They went back to first principles. They chose to trust their own methodical, hands-on, relentless process of discovery over the accepted wisdom of the world. That, right there, is the secret. It's a lesson that applies to any great challenge you'll ever face. When you're told that something is impossible, when the experts tell you that the data is settled, remember the 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton. They teach us that true breakthroughs don't come from following the crowd. They come from having the courage to question assumptions, to do your own research, and to trust the results of your own hard work. Their story is also a powerful reminder of the incredible synergy of partnership. Wilbur the visionary and Orville the engineer. Neither could have done it alone. They challenged each other, they argued with each other, and in doing so they made each other better. They show us that our greatest work is often done not in isolation, but in collaboration with someone who shares our passion, but sees the world from a slightly different angle. So what can we take away from this today? I think it comes down to a few simple ideas. First, cultivate your curiosity. Read everything. Learn about things that have nothing to do with your main goal. You never know where the next great idea will come from. For the Wrights, the key to controlling a plane in the air came from watching birds and understanding the balance of a bicycle. Second, don't be afraid to start from scratch. If the path laid out for you doesn't work, have the courage to build your own. That wind tunnel is a powerful metaphor for life. Sometimes you have to create your own data to find your way forward. And finally, be persistent. The Wrights faced years of failure, ridicule, and obscurity. They crashed gliders, battled mosquitoes, endured freezing nights, and were called cranks and liars. But they never stopped working. They had what their father called good mettle. They believed in their mission, and they simply refused to quit. That was a summary of the Wright Brothers by David McCullough. We've explored the incredible journey of these two remarkable men today. But a summary is like looking at a map of a beautiful country. It can show you the major landmarks, but it can never replace the experience of walking the trails yourself. The real power of this book is in McCullough's masterful storytelling, in the rich details of the letters, diaries, and personal accounts that bring this story to life. If any part of their journey has sparked your curiosity or inspired you, I wholeheartedly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's about understanding the very essence of innovation, persistence, and the unshakable power of a family's belief in one another. There's a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know that this work is making a difference, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration of another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.